We're going to be talking about randomization and trial supply management considerations and how to get your study started right. So those considerations we're going to talk about in quite a bit of detail, and we're going to talk about them in respect to the impacts. So what kind of impacts do those decisions that you have up front have later on down the road, and what are those things that you should be thinking about and questions that you should be asking? And that's really a really big part of what is needed when it comes to randomization and inventory. Is there's a lot of question marks, and we need to get those answered. And I would say that's across the board as well. We're also going to go through kind of piece by piece, a bit of a cheat sheet, so then you can see kind of how all the different decisions interact and those impacts, and a little bit about finding the right partner and the right platform. So starting off with those considerations. So on the left-hand side, you can see a list of considerations highlighted. So we're going to be talking about enrollment, CTM, so your clinical trial materials to be tracked, and that's not just your IP or device, that can also include your ancillary supplies. We're going to be talking about blinding or masking, expiry dates, and dispensing schedules. So all of those decisions that are made often up front, even in the protocol stages, can have some big impacts on some key areas. So your randomization list, how is that going to be generated? The labeling activities, and of course there's lots of timelines when it comes to labeling activities, and cost, and how is it going to all work out at the site level, and trying to get a head start on your supply strategy and understanding how some of those decisions can really impact there. Okay, so let's get started. We're talking about enrollment first. So some of those kind of key items that are really decided up front, especially the total enrollment. So total enrollment, of course, is heavily related to the stats part of the study. So there's not too much you can really kind of have discussions around there. That's already kind of laid out, your dropout rates, etc. But how do you distribute that across the number of sites? That's where it gets into the inventory aspect. So the number of sites can really impact how you're going to plan your overage for your labeling and your supply strategies. And you'll see as we go through, you'll see there's a lot of connections as we go through. There isn't really one that can be separated from another, but hopefully by the end of it, we'll understand all of those key questions to ask. So number of sites, the number of regions, and the enrollment rate per region. So looking at the bottom right corner, we have our list of impacts, and you can see we have quite a few check marks there. So when we're talking about enrollment and the number of sites, right away we're going to be thinking about the randomization list. And that's because based on the number, the total subjects that are going to be enrolled and how that's distributed across the number of sites, that can really impact whether you're going to determine, you're going to take more of a centralized approach versus a site-specific approach. And that's because that can really impact your block sizes and making sure you're managing your overall treatment ratio. So just a couple of notes there. So of course your blocking is based on your treatment ratio, and making sure you can maintain that for the overall study. If you're dividing up those blocks per site, and we'll get into a bit of an example, a case study in a moment. So hopefully that will help there. But when you're dividing those up across your different sites, then you can end up with incomplete blocks. If you're using a centralized approach, then that means that it's already spreading the subjects and the treatment arms around the different sites, because you're just maintaining that treatment ratio at the study level. There's also often a sweet spot with your supply and your number of sites, and that's also can be tied to your treatment ratios. So if you have maybe a funky block size and you have to maintain your treatment ratio at 3 to 3 to 1, for example, then you're going to have a block size of 7 at minimum. And that means that you have to, again, make sure you're maintaining the appropriate inventory on site to support that. So as you increase your number of sites, that means you have to maintain all of your different treatments, and you have to maintain that buffer to support the enrollment. So you can see how all of these can really add up and kind of exacerbate the other ones. For number of regions, then again, coming back to enrollment, how are you anticipating the enrollment is going to be spread out across the regions? Do we have to do additional pooling per region? And in that case, do you need to be looking at region-based enrollment and maintaining your treatment ratio at the region level? So all of these aspects you can see really can impact your randomization list. On the labeling side, we didn't touch on this relating to regions, but of course your country-specific labeling. So you have to understand your country-specific requirements. Do we have a scenario where maybe you're doing US and Canada? So of course, Canada has the additional expiration date requirements. Can you provide the supporting the supporting expiry memos in place of that, and just have your manufacturer date? And then otherwise, depending on how many countries that you're planning on supporting, are you going to do a single supply? Are you going to divide that up and have specific supply designated for each region? And that's going to impact labeling, because are you doing booklet labeling? Are you able to do single panel? And there's costs with each of those as well. Let's go ahead into our case study here. So our total enrollment in this example is 100. Our number of sites, we have 25. And so right now, when I'm looking at this, we're already dividing up our enrollment quite a bit. What are the number of regions? We have 3, and the enrollment rate per region. So in this case, we've said it's unknown. We're going to default to the average. So even if we're looking at the defaulting to the average, that means we're going to average about 4 subjects per site. That's not very much. And of course, some are going to enroll more than others. And so again, when we talked about the randomization list, we're looking at, okay, we're going to want to do centralized randomization if possible, because that's going to minimize the additional actions required to maintain the treatment ratio. For labeling, then of course it depends on the regions that we're working on. So we might want to do a single panel labeling, individual per site or per region. And then our supply strategy is going to be also tied to if we're managing that inventory at the labeling at the regional level or not. Any questions? And maybe I should ask, can I ask for questions in between?
Yeah, can.
Any questions about enrollment and impacts to your study? Okay, we'll go ahead to our next one. So our clinical trial materials to be tracked. So a big one right up front is going to be, are you talking about randomized versus non-randomized inventory? If you're looking at randomized inventory, then you need to be generating a corresponding kit list that's going to manage the treatment ratio. Are you doing a scrambled kit list? Are you doing a kit list that's sequential? And how are you going to maintain the blind there? We won't talk about the blinding too much because we have that later on, but just some things to think about up front. Our treatment arms, how many treatment arms do we have? That's going to mean that we have to, of course, make sure we have sufficient of each of those treatment arms. And going back to our previous slide, we were talking about making sure we have understand our treatment ratio, our enrollment, and we need to make sure that the balance of your labeling of your supplies aligns with that per treatment. For the different CTM types, so you might have different treatment arms, but you also might have different inventory. So you might have some inventory, maybe you have some ancillary supplies, maybe you have rescue medication in addition to your IP, then all of that has to be considered in your supply strategy and labeling activities. You can't just kind of leave one out and you have to pick back up then. For bulk versus individual, that's a key question to ask for each of your inventory types. Are you going to be managing it at the lot or batch based, or are you going to have an individual serialized number? If you're going to have a serialized number, that of course increases your ability to for traceability, because you can match up a specific subject with a specific kit number, vial number, etc. But when you're talking about bulk, then there's a certain amount of ease that you can manage on the dispensing side, because you can just say I dispensed 5 of lot 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can move on to the next step. And part of that, and I don't want to get into too much of this as well yet, is about whether you're going to be, is this bottles that are going out of IP and then coming back, and you have to maintain the accountability at the tablet level. Are you doing any redispensing? Because there's impacts there. As you are looking at bulk items, then those bulk items can make it a bit tricky when you're doing any redispensing, because inventory is coming back in, it's coming back out. How do you know one bottle is different from another? And also, when we're talking about bulk versus individual, there's quite a bit of cost involved, and that's because you're labeling, but not just at the labeling, it's also, is it labeled prior to it being received at your distribution center? Is it going to be, if so, then it needs to be individually confirmed per item, because you have to make sure that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 were received. And that also applies on the shipping side. So when the depot is getting ready to pick and pack, then again, they have to make sure they can't just grab 5. They have to make sure that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, et cetera. So there's additional costs that are added right away for each of those shipments that you're going to have, and for the initial receipt. Just coming back to the dosing, so if you're doing if you are completing maybe weight-based dosing and you need to administer a set number of vials, then again, that's where it can be a little bit better to, there can be some additional benefits for managing on the bulk side. Comparative procurement, and I think many of you are very aware of the procurement challenges these days. For procurement, we've seen a lot of timelines that are closer to 6 to 12 weeks, whereas we used to be able to move a little bit quicker, and I'd say before COVID times. And in that case, is there any option for local sourcing for your comparators? So at the same time, do you have any rescue medications? So maybe you can have the site supply their own aspirin, their own acetaminophen, et cetera. Some challenges there for the local sourcing is, how are you going to maintain and manage the tracking of supplies? And that goes back to if your vendor is able to support those activities. Of course, labeling is not applicable if you're going to do local sourcing, but often what we're seeing is a combination of centrally sourced, so your depot is doing a certain amount of labeling, and then kind of supplemented with the local sourcing if supplies are either delayed because of that longer lead time, or because just for overall availability. And that, of course, impacts the site workflow, because the site needs to be able to dynamically manage anything that's supplied from the sponsor as well as the site. So it's really important to have that defined as soon as possible, so you can also communicate those intricacies when you're doing your site selection. Are they able to do that sourcing locally? Is this something that they can support? And otherwise, it might be that they're not able to come on board at all, or maybe they can't come on board right away. For overage, so depending on the number of items, number of types, bulk versus individual, all of that comes down to your supply strategy. And so your inventory that you're tracking, if you are, like I said before, if you're tracking multiple treatment arms, you have to maintain that supply on site. You also want to be thinking about, what are the minimum requirements for randomization if it's a randomized trial? How many do you need to have on site per treatment arm? And I see that because that's one of those tools to support blinding and maintaining the blind. So all of that comes together. So our example here, our case study. So our scenario is that we have a randomized supply. There's 2 treatment arms, active versus placebo. We have our rescue medication. Our dosing is an weight-based dosing. It's an infusion. And what are we going to do about bulk versus individual? And we have, what can we do about the comparator procurement? So when we're looking at our different treatment arms, and this comes down to an item that we're going to get into a bit later, is what's that site workflow? Are we able to have an unblinded pharmacist? Is that something that can be supported? Does that make sense when it comes to the infusion activities, or is it something that can still be blinded enough? And of course, if we're looking at the comparator procurement, so if we are going to have any local sourcing, that could be for saline. We could also do that for the rescue medication as applicable, but that's going to have some additional challenges. For the randomization list, of course, if you are doing any comparator local sourcing, then that means that you can't have that inventory blinded because it's being provided by the site. It's not being provided by the sponsor. There isn't that same level of labeling. So of course you can keep it blinded for the actual infusion, but the unblinded pharmacist would be a key part in the process. So that means that you would, for labeling, you would be only labeling your specific your IP and your active treatment arm. And for that labeling, you can have it open, you can have it unblinded because if you think about kind of your target audience. Okay. So just moving to our next group, we have our blinding requirements, and we've touched on a little bit about this already. Of course, the blinding requirements are going to stem from your protocol, but again, if we're looking at those protocol requirements up front, then there's some different aspects to consider. And a big part is what's the feasibility of blinding those supplies, and how can that be managed at the site to maintain separate blinded versus unblinded groups. The blinding of the supplies, again, goes back to the being able to source that centrally, and then also who's going to be unblinded. So is it going to be just the unblinded pharmacist? Can you have an additional, any additional parties? And of course, if you have an unblinded pharmacist, then you need to make sure you have all of those groups supporting them, which is the unblinded monitors, unblinded, the unblinded oversight, the unblinded PM, and who at your vendors are going to be unblinded. On the overage side, so you want to make sure that you have sufficient inventory and maintaining that buffer as evenly as possible across the different treatment arms to make sure that it's not unblinding when, if you only have 2 of one treatment arm and when it drops down to 1, it's always going to raise a request. Well, you know right away that you're going to, you can kind of determine who's going to be on what treatment. And so you have to adjust your supply strategy to make sure that it can add that extra level of blinding to ensure that there's that there isn't any potential for that. And of course, there's you can argue that no one has time to be sitting there and watching their inventory that closely, but the purpose of that is to make sure that you're doing as much as possible to maintain the blind, and you have your due diligence and can document that accordingly. So here, I'm going to skip ahead to the case study because I think that really helps us discuss some of the aspects. So here we're talking about a double-blinded protocol, and again, our blinded supplies. So we're not able to do that. We have to do local sourcing. We're not able to procure the inventory that we need. And who's going to be unblinded. So I think I touched on most of these. So we talked about the site level. At the sponsor, vendor, and CRO level, then we talked about unblinded monitor and unblinded PM, but we also have to think about other groups. So of course, the depot is going to be unblinded. Any IRT, RTSM team is going to be unblinded, as well as often the QA team, and the QA team being the group that is going to be reviewing for any temperature excursions. It is possible to maintain the blind there, but again, there's extra steps that need to be completed. So that goes down to your kind of site workflow. If inventory is damaged or experiences a temperature excursion, how are you managing that? Are you going to manage it in a blinded way? Are you going to manage it in an unblinded way? And really that's dictated, that's generally dictated based on if your supplies are in fact blinded or unblinded. The supply team, of course, they can be blinded, but the difficulty there is that then they're not able to have that in-depth oversight if you're managing at an unblinded level. So here we have a note here about the overage. And again, because the inventory is unblinded and we're managing it separately, we can really kind of, we can minimize the need for kind of topping things up just to maintain the blind, because we already have our communication that's kind of separated out there. So here, our randomization list from an inventory perspective would not be applicable because we're talking about unblinded inventory. The labeling, it could be unblinded, just like we talked about there. And then we touched on the site and supply strategy. So definitely lots of impacts when we're discussing blinding requirements and the considerations there. Okay, expiry dates. So we're getting to the end here. So our expiry dates, what is the current stability? And do you have ongoing stability? Are you managing retest dates? And of course, overage never, never goes away. And that's because when we're looking at labeling, then you want to be adjusting your labeling campaigns based on the expected enrollment rates with, of course, buffer and overage, but also always thinking about what your expiry dates are. So that's one of those questions we ask right up front. What are the expiry dates that we're managing? So then we can provide any support around looking at how much you want to label and when your labeling campaigns are going to be scheduled. And then on the supply strategy side, of course, that's where we don't want to be looking out 6 months ahead for something that is going to expire in 3 months. So it's something that you need to really carefully adjust. And that flexibility is important, that you can kind of make a change as you're coming up to the end of an expiry date, or if you're coming up to a new labeling campaign, so that you can kind of keep your inventory maybe a bit tighter just before, so then you're ready to, and then you can adjust it back when that new inventory is available. So we have a scenario where we have 12 months, we're expecting to extend to 18 months. And just like we talked about, we want to restrict labeling campaigns and predictive resupply our look aheads to make sure that we're maintaining or minimizing any waste. I'll go quickly on the last one. So our dispensing schedule, is it standard? Is it variable? What are our visit windows? What's the overage that we want to have per dispensing time point? And we'll look at that scenario right away. So variable, so let's say we have 4 weeks and a 12 weeks, and you want to be thinking about that visit window, that plus minus few days here and there can really make a difference. And our overage per dispensing time point, we're going to say 10 days on the 4-week side and 15 days on the 12-week side. And so you want to be thinking about, when you're doing your labeling, when you're doing your bottling, how many tablets do you need to have in have in your container to make sure that you're not having to dispense a whole extra bottle just for a few extra pills to last those few last days of the planned visit window. We have our summary of the consideration and impacts that we talked about here. So we have our different considerations and the impacts for each. As we discussed today, there's lots of questions to ask, and we touched on many of those today. This really helps make sure there's that faster startup. You're collecting those information, you're asking those questions up front, and you're able to make those decisions early on. So you know, okay, we're going to have a longer lead time because we have this procurement issue. However, for our first few sites, we've confirmed they're able to get up and running fast enough because they have local sourcing. You can also standardize those considerations and what questions you're asking, so then you can make sure they're easily repeatable, and that helps the team as a whole. On selecting the right team member, I'm just going to kind of breeze through these, but here you can see some of the key criteria. And part of that, you really want to understand and be able to answer those questions up front, so then you can make sure that they can support all of your needs. Not everyone can support, not all systems can support batch-based inventory, for example, or locally sourced inventory. So it's really important to identify that that's a need up front, and be able to understand if that's something that can be supported. So Axiom here we have our randomization and our trial supply management are two different modules there. And we are flexible in our approach to being able to support your studies. We can do that IRT only option. We can also provide our EDC. So that also feeds into those initial discussions about your needs. Everything from simple to complex on the inventory side throughout the hierarchy, and of course that auto resupply aspect. So we're here to answer any questions that you have and support you in any way. A big part of what we do is that strategy piece, and hopefully you're able to understand a little bit more about some of those key questions to ask and how some of those decisions up front can really impact your study overall. So thank you so much to all of you that attended, and of course to the ARENA team for hosting. So thank you for taking your time today.